Welcome to Systems Philosophy. In the previous episode, we introduced language into culture and tracked the biological changes that humanity has undergone since we separated from the last common ancestor between ourselves and our nearest relatives. The changes have been extensive in our bodies and our minds. We walk upright confidently. Our hands are highly dexterous, good for tool use. We have corresponding brain areas that help us with the fine motor controls and nerves in the fingertips. Our larynx has descended, our breath control has improved, and we've grown the neocortex. Culture, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, is a separate information carrying field. It transmits from mind to mind, just like genes transmit from generation to generation. But it is a novel and separate area of transmission. Language and culture are highly correlated. All humans talk or have a sort of language. Even the deaf have got sign language, which was a substitute for the spoken word. Sounds can have meaning even in animals that don't speak. Bird calls have been shown to warn not just of predator and danger, but often of the specific type of predator and danger. So we have an association between the call and the experience, pre-language. Language allows abstraction. The abstraction can happen by association, as I've just described. With language, the abstraction grows and becomes pervasive. When we point at a tree, we can't distinguish that particular action from the tree or a tree. Language does. And as we learn our language, we get representations so that we see a tree, the parents point at the object and call it a tree, and because you have multiple objects with the same name, you start to generalize to the category. Therefore, the word tree becomes associated not with the tree, but with a specific concept, the concept of a tree. That is different from the concept of a bush. We have different words, and the categories might merge. We can have bushy trees, and we can have tree-like bushes, or tall bushes, or whatever you want to do as your descriptor. So the categories themselves are fixed within our language, and we vary them through things like adverbs and nouns and all sorts of descriptors that. So the tree by Henderson's Road preserve, or the big tree by Henderson's Road, or whatever, refers to a specific tree. We're talking the tree, but we don't have a name for the tree. We might have a name for an object, which makes it even easier. We don't need to describe it. We can call it Jackson's Hill, instead of saying the hill behind the shed to the left. Labeling specific objects and places allows you to use them just without taking the time to describe them. So language is flexible enough to encompass new concepts and thoughts. And specific enough to identify an individual object, like a person's name, like the name of a place, and then starts to generalize to a group of places, like a town or a city or a hamlet. Language organizes thinking. It also labels thinking. As we look at the tree, we see it, we smell it, we feel it, and we talk the name tree. Language makes the associations of our senses with the concept. That's not always explicit, because the human experience is so embedded in language that we often abstract our very experiences to language. Most of us have an internal narrator that acts as a sort of language description of what we're experiencing, what we're thinking, and it mixes thoughts of the past, interpretation of experience, plans of action, and intentions. This is the confabulator, the internal language process that acts at a time offset to actual reality of about 1/3 to 1/2 of a second. So when we confabulate, we have already experienced or thought the thought in a non-verbal sense, and our language centers are organizing and labeling those thoughts, much like we label data for a large language model. Language, because it organizes thoughts, also transmits the concepts that those thoughts organize. So if we have a certain worldview, say Newtonian mechanics, that this is a clockwork universe because physics shows it to be so, then we build framings or paradigms around which we organize thoughts around concepts. Newtonian mechanics or physics are labels, just like general relativity and quantum mechanics are labels for the greater category of physics. So language nests concepts or paradigms. We can say that the trees are in the forest is on the plain. We can express relational information, both specific, in that Joe had a cup of cappuccino coffee this morning, or in the general. People often like to drink coffee in the mornings. Language helps us organize our thoughts. Language, therefore, is tightly bound to unwelt and cognition. Okay. Language also operates separately. We inherit a language. The language of our parents is the language we learn, which was the language of their grandparents, or presumably we could cross cultures and learn a new language, even start to integrate to a different culture. That usually involves moving physically or moving your primary group of friends. It's very rare that a whole culture will spontaneously adapt a new language. When you're changing languages, you're usually transitioning from one group to another and from one culture to another often, because language and culture are highly correlated. And so is language and ways of thinking and viewing the world. You can study languages because languages, even though they are transmitted throughout, well, from parent to offspring, and stabilized by daily use. When you travel around geographically, places like England in particular and Europe, because the languages have been stable for a long period of time, you will find slight differences to the way that people talk. Even in the USA, language drifts. It drifts because we share language within the local group, but slight inflections, the accents of a person that's come in, even colloquial terms and ways of describing things start to drift the dynamic equilibrium of the shared language culture within a region, just like the gene pool of a species starts to drift within a particular habitat or region. Language undergoes the same dynamic equilibrium and reflexive coupling. It couples to human minds and human bodies in ways that I've talked about already. It couples to other people. How I use language will affect how you perceive my language. How you use your language will affect how I understand you. If we're interacting on a regular basis, then dynamic equilibrium will drift between misunderstanding and correction because we are sharing the same space, communicating ideas about the real world. And if we miscommunicate, we can easily discover that miscommunication because of our ongoing interaction. So language itself undergoes a sort of dynamic equilibrium drift, as is experienced by the local accents, and also a dynamic equilibrium attractor state. Just like culture, if it's something that's shared and transmitted between individuals, then I can't make up my own random language and expect everyone to understand me. There are cultural norms and language norms to which people conform in order to effectively communicate. And even though we all have our individual idiosyncrasies, we can talk about the pool of regional dialect, or the pool of English speakers, or the pool of Canadian French speakers. We can see the drift of language, and if we track language further back in human past, we can see that languages morph and change, much like species. They undergo the same forces because they're the same. They're systems in dynamic equilibrium, coupled to other systems in dynamic equilibrium, carried by groups of individuals, much like species. Instead of transmission through reproduction, the transmission is through use, through cooperation, through imitation, through education. We can develop a language tree which is highly correlated to the evolutionary tree. We can talk about the root language. We can talk about the Indo-European languages, which cover things from Indian and Sanskrit and all the way into French and Spanish and English and German. Languages can merge, which is probably something that genes can't. So if we have perhaps a settlement that comprises immigrants from France and immigrants from England, then we can start to create, well, perhaps the more topical thing is Spanglish, which is the merger of the New World Spanish, that is the legacy of the Spanish colonization of America, and English, which is the legacy of the English colonization of America. Spanish and Portuguese, largely South America, English and French, mainly English in North America, and at the Mexican-USA border, we get close interaction between the two cultures. We get economic migrants moving from Mexico to the more prosperous economy of the USA, and they start to learn English, and we get the concept of Spanglish, a sort of mixture between English and Spanish, which is the evolution of languages at work. The concept that I'm trying to really emphasize today is that systems thinking, dynamic equilibrium, drift, and evolution don't just apply to biology. They apply to culture and specifically language. Linguists talk about the evolution of languages. The way that languages are transmitted is fundamentally different to genetics. Languages actually don't exist other than as memories and actions inside people, as artifacts carved into stone. Language is purely idea. You could say that genes have a substance. They're composed of DNA, nucleic acids, the code of life. And it's difficult to separate the form and function, the information and matter within the single cell. As we have moved into language and culture, we get into the territory of software and hardware. Software is the total ephemeral, something we can talk about, but something that is a pure information structure. We create technology that runs software, just like biology has evolved the capability to use and transmit language. The act of transmission is a physical act. I use breath, I move my tongue and my mouth, and I vocalize. The act of listening is a physical act. The air vibrates through my vocalizations. The eardrums transmit that vibration through the bones of the inner ear into the cochlea, where the transducers separate the frequencies, and sections of our brain have evolved specifically to pick out the subtle nuances and turn the sounds of speech into the symbolic representations of language. Information and thought are ephemeral. They're stored in weights and connections in the brain, neurons that fire in certain patterns to certain stimuli. That is, in principle, not much different to the way that software is stored in computers. We have transistors that use electron flows and electron potentials to switch those flows, and logic gates that allow programs to represent symbols within those flows. And ultimately, we've been able to take that very technology and mathematical models that approximate the way that neurons share and transmit information and create new receptacles for human culture, which we refer to as large language models. We already had software, which is the abstracted logic of computers translated from the logic of mathematics and philosophy, of the scientific thinkers, of the abstraction that language allows. With large language models, what we've done is we've bypassed the need to explicitly code the rules. We have found a way to teach computers, much like we teach our children, by speaking to them and showing them. Now, the methods of training vary from huge volumes of text to videos and sound and all sorts of evolving technologies, and I use that word deliberately and emphasized it deliberately because eventually we'll see that the same principles that we've been tracking also apply to technology. For the moment, it's important to note that human mastery of making sounds specific enough to allow abstracted speech has reflexively coupled to our biology to build brains that allow us to manage abstractions that can only be carried by speech, that are very difficult to represent in the pantomime of the non-verbal world. And we have therefore inhabited a different unwelt to our nearest living primates. We can bring them into that unwelt because we still share significant biology, which is why we can teach chimpanzees to sign, and we can communicate basic concepts with them, like waterbird for duck. They understand the concepts that we're abstracting, but they don't have the mental evolved machinery that the waterbird leads to. Mathematics, concepts of, well, that's something for another day. The higher level abstractions is enough. Philosophy covers that. I have emphasized today that the same dynamics that select genes in the gene pool of a species also coordinate language in the meme pool of a culture, of a tribe. Because we're talking about fundamental different mechanisms, the metaphors only take you so far. And I've leaned on the similarities, and you can just as easily point out the differences. That's the nuance that language allows us to explore. We can talk about, when does a tree become a bush? What's the difference between a tree and a bush? We apply basic categories, which helps us communicate, but those categories are always just convenient abstractions that have evolved and persisted through the history of language use. I think that's a good point to end it for today. This has been Systems Philosophy.